Welcome to Psychology 101. My name is Professor Elizabeth Jeglick, and I'm going to be your guide as we go through this Introduction to Psychology, which is really a much more of a survey course. So we're going to be looking at all aspects of psychology. So this is actually one of my favorite courses to teach because psychology really encompasses almost everything we do, and we're going to be touching on a lot of that. And you'll see that pretty much everything that you are doing every minute of every day has some element of psychology to it. It's just a really fascinating field. So we're going to be working from the Myers textbook, Psychology in Modules. So each lecture is going to be comprised of one module, and we'll be doing several lectures per lesson. So the first module, Module 1, is the story of psychology, which is a little bit about the history. Harvard astronomer Owen Gingerich called the human brain by far the most complex physical object known to us in the entire cosmos. And so if you really think about, how incredibly complex the universe is, that kind of makes a very profound statement because it shows how important and how complex our brain is. As a mother of three, it never ceases to amaze me that the unification of an egg and a sperm can result in such a complex human being. You have to think that, for your children to do what they're doing, to grow, to develop, like what is involved with that and how the brain really can, evolve and grow and develop and learn is just incredibly amazing. It really baffles the mind. So while people may say that psychology is a newer science, it's really been around for, hundreds of years. It's actually gone, people go as far back as the 4th century BC with Aristotle because he was asking questions to understand the relationship between the body and the psyche. So already back then there was an understanding that the mind was something different from the physical body. And so he answered those questions by observing and making guesses, which was kind of a preliminary form of the scientific method, which we'll be learning about later. William Wundt was one of the ones that was given the honor of having the first psychology laboratory where he was actually doing formalized testing of psychological principles. And he was really the first person to kind of give psychology the elements to help make psychology a science. There's still, while initially people used to think psychology was an art, you're finding it more and more related to science discipline, and therefore you're finding it more compared to a more rigorous biological chemistry, physical science. So Wundt carefully measured observations, as we would do in other types of sciences, and he conducted experiments which were controlled. And so people then started paying more attention. Almost all of the stuff that you're going to be reading about in your textbook has been extensively researched, and experiments have been done, and we have evidence to support its validity. One of Wundt's students, Edward Titchener, was kind of the developer of what's known today as structuralism. So he relied on self-report data. A lot of you are going to be participating in experiments this semester, and a lot of them are based on self-report measures. So these are measures where you're asked questions about your internal thought processes, your feelings, and you have to report how you're feeling, how you're thinking. And so this was based on introspection and reporting of sensation and other elements of experience and reaction to stimuli such as the smell or feel of a flower. So previously science had only been looking at things that were observable to the human eye. And so this was really novel in that, he was asking the subjects themselves to report observations. And so Titchener tried to use these introspective reports to build a view of the mind structure, and he called this view structuralism. So he tried to understand the mind by the subject's self-report. William James was one who developed functionalism, and he studied human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and asked what function might they serve? How might they have helped our ancestors survive? So what is the purpose of our feelings? Like, why do we feel sad? Why do we feel happy? Why do we feel scared? And based on this, he wrote the Principles of Psychology, which took him 12 years to write. He then mentored another pioneer who was actually the first female president of the APA. She got her doctorate by studying it at Harvard, or she did the equivalent of a doctorate, but it was because Harvard only gave doctorates to males. She never actually received her doctorate. They offered to give it to her from the female college associated with Harvard. However, she refused, and if she couldn't get it from Harvard, she didn't want it. So the definition of psychology has shifted over the years. So kind of according to Wundt and Edward Titchener around the 1900s, Psychology was the science of mental life. However, cognitive psychologists, those that kind of studied internal processes that were kind of guided by neuroscience, really felt like there was a more of a biological aspect and a scientific aspect to psychology. So now we combine these definitions and we define psychology as the science of behavior and mental processes. And this is what we're going to be discussing throughout the course. So there are different subfields or different theologists in psychology who look at the world through different kind of perspectives. It's almost in some ways similar to kind of a religious belief, but people have different theories of why humans do what they do. Behaviorism is one of those. You may have heard about this. Those of you who are familiar with Ivan Pavlov and his dogs and how he conditioned them to salivate to a bell understand the principles of behaviorism, and we'll be talking about that more when we talk about learning. But John Watson was one of the first kind of behaviorists here in the U.S., and what he did was little Albert was a baby that you see a picture on the right, and he had a bunny that he liked. And Watson started pairing the presentation of the little stuffed bunny with a very scary noise, which would make little Albert cry. And so then, just by showing little Albert the bunny, even without the noise, little Albert started crying because it was associated with that scary noise. So this is kind of one of the first experiments that demonstrated classical conditioning and how you could pair things, and that, if you think about the development of phobias, like why are you afraid of certain things? So, why are you afraid of dogs? Because maybe you were bitten by a dog, and so now whenever you see a dog, you feel fear because of the pain. Poor little Albert. This would not be considered to be ethical today. And so, while it's great that we had these historical experiments, many of these would definitely not be able to be done today. B.F. Skinner kind of used operant conditioning, whereby he was able to teach pigeons to do amazing things to get rewards. He later wrote about human communities could be shaped by this method as well. And it was actually called Walden's World, and people actually lived in these commune-type communities which were based on operant conditioning. Many of you are familiar with Dr. Sigmund Freud out of Vienna, Austria. He is basically credited as being the founder of psychoanalysis. We're going to be learning more about psychoanalysis later on in the semester. But he studied and helped people with a variety of mental disorders. So he was kind of a private practitioner. People came to him in his office, and based on what he saw, he then theorized a lot about, mental processes and why people are behaving the way he did. He really emphasized the importance of childhood experiences and the development of people's personalities. And I think if you look at yourself, you can very much see how the experiences, both good and bad, that you had as a child very much influence who you are today and how you view the world. For example, if you had very supportive parents, if you had parents who neglected you, if you were abused, all those things factor into the person you are today and how you relate to the world and other people around you. He also talked about the role of unconscious drives, wishes, and needs. So he developed the three structures of the id, ego, and superego, where the id was kind of the pleasure principle, the little child, if you may, wanting to get whatever they want. And then the superego was kind of the parent looking down and saying, no, this is what you can and cannot do. We'll learn more about Freud and some of his great and wacky theories in the course. Then there was also a trend in humanism. This evolved kind of after the war in an effort to kind of look at the good side of humanity, because we've been looking at some of the most evil parts, with the Holocaust. And so Maslow, who was actually a Holocaust survivor, developed a hierarchy of needs and talked about how people self-actualize, so the most successful people. And he put, kind of lower level basic needs like food, drink, clothing, shelter, that kind of stuff at the bottom, and then self-actualization at the top, which makes sense because there's no way that you can work on yourself as a human being if your basic needs are not being met. Carl Rogers was a therapist who practiced unconditional self-regard, and so he used active listening to really help the client and give very positive feedback to the client in an effort to kind of reach their full potential. So psychology has grown tremendously as a field. It's one of the largest majors in most universities. And as you'll see throughout this course, psychology comes from a lot of different disciplines. So you'll see elements of physiology, philosophy, medicine, and biology interspersed through a lot of the work that we're doing. Advances in psychology have also been made in many countries. I mean, a lot of what we know now as psychology started out in Europe and then has been developed largely in North America in the last decade or so, but work continues all around the world. and it's spreading rapidly. There are now 71 member nations in the IUPS. So the subjects studied in psychology have also multiplied as we come to realize that pretty much everything we do involves psychology. Like we're seeing a lot, with the war that's going on in the Middle East. There are a lot of psychologists who are working there. They work on, how to do interrogation, how not to do interrogation. They work with those who are coming back from the war and how to deal with some of the things that they experienced and how to cope effectively. So we have a role in pretty much everything that goes on. One of the big issues in psychology is the nature-nurture question. So to what extent are our traits already set in place at birth, so our nature, and to what extent do our traits develop in response to our environment or experience, so our nurture? So how much of it of our personalities are we born with, and how much of it develops as a consequence of what is around us? This debate has gone through history with those such as Plato, Descartes, and Darwin being on the nature side, and those such as Aristotle and John Locke being on the nurture side. You may have heard the term tabula rasa. That was kind of coined by John Locke, meaning blank slate. And basically he philosophized or theorized that people were born a blank slate and it's really their experiences. But we know now that that's not actually true, that there really is some combination of both nature and nurture, because they do studies on identical twins who are reared apart. So there are twins who have 100% of the same genetic material, and then they're reared in different environments, so they were separated at birth for one reason or another. They didn't know of one another. And when they look at them and study them as adults, they find that there's a lot of similarities, both in terms of their intelligence, the careers they choose, their likes, their dislikes, but there are also differences. So the similarities might be attributed to the nature part of it, and the differences might be attributed to the nurture part of it. So as I said, we kind of at this point have accepted it. It's really an interplay between nature and nurture. Nurture works on what nature endows. So what we talk about now in psychology is the biopsychosocial theory. So basically, we think that people have a biological predisposition, and that the environment or the society around them really influences, how those genetic predispositions are affected. And then you have the psychology of thoughts, emotions, moods that interplays with that. And so that kind of impacts all of us. And so when we talk about different disorders or whatever, you'll often hear about the biopsychosocial theory. So to give you an example, so if somebody is shy, they may have a biological predisposition to be shy. There might be some hormonal influences. Their brain structures may, lead them to be shy. There might be, some sort of genetic predisposition. There might also be social cultural influences, so it might be related to the presence of others, cultural societal norms, peers and other group influences, and then other models in their life, like the media. There are also psychological influences, such as learned fears or other expectations, emotional responding, so some people just can't handle large, emotional responses, and the way that we interpret information, our cognitive processing. So you can see somebody who is shy might be born, might have a genetic predisposition to be shy. People in their family tend to be on the quieter side. In addition, they may live in a culture where it's not okay to express yourself, or they model themselves after somebody who's not very outgoing. And they might be a person who just generally, interprets the world a little bit more hostilely and stays close to themselves. So there are a lot of subfields in psychology, so biological psychology, developmental, cognitive, personality, social, positive psychology. And there are also applied fields like clinical psychology, which is what I am, where you can practice and see patients and you're licensed. Counseling psychology, which is typically people who work with individuals who have less severe problems, so generally not schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but just generally problems adjusting, job problems, etc. Educational psychologists work in the classroom. Industrial organizational psychologists work with industry. Community psychologists work with the community. And I don't know why we have clinical psychologists there. So I know some of you wanted to learn about the differences between psychologists and psychiatrists. So the biggest difference really is that psychiatrists are medical doctors, or DOs, doctors of osteopathic medicine. They have to go to medical school and do a residency in psychiatry. And psychiatrists prescribe medication. Psychologists, unless they've received some additional training where it's allowed in certain states, do not prescribe medication. Psychologists specialize in treatment using psychotherapy and assessment. While psychiatrists do a rotation in psychotherapy, they're not really trained to be therapists. Secondly, they don't get reimbursed very much for doing psychotherapy, so it's always questionable when psychiatrists do psychotherapy. So most psychologists generally do psychotherapy and assessment, and we do not prescribe medication. So that is the lecture for Module 1, and let me know if you have any questions.